I want to talk about the role of psychology in healing, but also talk about some of the problems. For many years, I was a professor of psychology in several universities, as well as a licensed therapist. Can we have quiet, please? And one of the things I've learned, that psychology is quite limited in its ability and usefulness for healing. And the other thing I want to say too, and what I've said before in the last two talks, even theophostic prayer can have its limitations, because sometimes we have to deal with other issues like deliverance, like the role of evil spirits in our illness, and we'll talk about that tomorrow. But also there's such a thing as generational sin and generational healing, another problem, healing the family tree. So we're going to talk about that again tomorrow. So there's a lot of issues here that transcend sometimes the natural and the simply human level. Carl Rogers, Abraham Maslow, and people like that are considered the father of humanistic psychology. Rogers, for example, came out of the 30s and 40s. He was once a Protestant minister, I believe Presbyterian. His wife became very sick, and he talks about how difficult it was for him when she was an invalid. His wife dropped her own interests and wasn't able any longer to carry out many of the things they did together. Her love became more of a clinging love, he said. Carl felt he had to live his own life and be his own person, which is the basis of his humanistic psychology. Otherwise, he could not be of help to her. If he simply says, "All right, since you need me so much, I will stay with you all the time, and I'll sacrifice my life to take care of you," then he felt it would destroy both of them. If I give up my life or personhood to take care of her, then I would become bitter. I would become angry on the inside of what I had given up. I would no longer want to be with her. If I did give up my interest and life for her, then it would be out of a sense of duty. That's not the kind of relationship I wanted with her, nor is the kind of relationship she would appreciate, either though she might think she would. And so I feel I got to be my own person, live my own life, and that way I'll be much more free to be a person with her, take care of her, and really care for her when I am with her. Now, on the other hand, when Carl himself had been sick, his wife totally dedicated herself to him, gave up her own needs and interests, and totally was with him all the time. He didn't complain then. Rogers knew he was in a bad light and didn't care. He was in a bad place because he was concerned about doing his own thing, than about doing what he was promised to do. In his words, "I really don't give a damn what anyone else thinks what I do," and that's a very releasing feeling. Now, Roger held two basic assumptions. One is that people are basically good as long as they're not forced to do things they do not want to do. It follows that human evil is a result of a bad environment. If one is simply left to do what he's inclined to do from an internal impulse, then peace and tranquility will follow. The second assumption is the origin of the good for the individual is within the individual exclusively. Any external influence for the good is purely accidental. Our nature is such that we're born with these inner tendencies to autonomous fulfillment. The autonomous man cannot but help contribute to the benefits of man. For the humanists, conflict is extrinsic to the individual, and that's the source of unhappiness and sickness. Now, what's all that imply? That implies there's no such thing as original sin. That man is basically good. If you just leave him to himself unhindered, then he would do good things. The problem is we don't leave him to himself. We try to control him many ways by the environment. We force him to do things he doesn't like to do, and that's what makes it a problem. So conflict will arise outside the person when they suppress their autonomous tendencies, that is, when they decide no longer to be their own person. Such conflict arises when parents are not permissive with their children, or when a parent's love depends on the performance of the child. Parents who give their children unconditional positive regard enhance the child's process towards autonomy. Then the child will develop self-acceptance and self-esteem. People who do not experience unconditional acceptance from others fail to develop self-acceptance. They end up doing what others tell them to do by reacting against what others tell them to do. In either case, they do not do what they truly desire. This leads to a conflict between what they see themselves do and their ideal self. The result, again, would be poor self-esteem and lack of self-acceptance. They are the victims of their surroundings. People are in conflict because they are not doing their own will, but that of others. They're acting out of obedience to external authority rather than internal norms. They're in conflict between their actual and ideal self. Now, how many here basically heard this philosophy or agree with it? I'm sure most of you have. In fact, this is exactly what's being taught today in most of our schools, especially in our universities. Now, on the surface, it sounds pretty good. We put so much emphasis on self-esteem. I hear that all the time. Father, my problem is I have low self-esteem. Well, what's that mean? We're going to talk about it a little bit later and the problems with that understanding. Once there was a priest that was preaching on John's Gospel, and many of the congregation were yawning and fidgeting and with their purses and prayer books. Then the priest said, as Eric Fromm says, and immediately everybody paid attention, it seems that there are two faiths, faith in God and faith in psychology. Many assume they're two paths to the same goal, because isn't salvation basically being one's true self? Paul Vitz, used to be a psychologist at Stanford University, wrote that psychology has become a religion which is deeply anti-Christian and hostile to most religions. As such, it is extensively supported by schools, universities, and social programs, financed by taxes collected from millions of Christians. Psychology as religion for 4 years has been destroying individual families and communities. Now, by the way, this is one of the problems back in the 60s and 70s why so many priests started studying psychology rather than theology. And many of those days, psychology became the theology. In fact, if you remember, many of the homilies preached back in the 70s were psychology, rather than really out of the scriptures or spirituality. Paul Vitz was a professor of psychology over 20 years. When he was in graduate school at Stanford, he said anyone who held traditional beliefs about religion were considered rigid or authoritarian. And by the way, that's still pretty well true today. I'm considered very rigid because I agree with the church on its teachings. The kind of psychology Vitz is talking about is humanistic or self-psychology, which is the main orientation of psychology taught in our schools, which has totally permeated our culture, which we now take for granted, many of its tenets and propositions. It has very subtly crept into our culture that we naturally accept and don't even realize it. It affects our attitudes and thinking in almost every area of our life. One of the most confusing aspects is that both humanistic psychology and Christianity use many of the same terms, but they have very different meanings. Much of humanistic psychology is borrowed from Eastern mysticism and thus shares New Age concepts and beliefs. Many liberal theologians today have psychologized religion to the extent it's very difficult to tell the difference. Instead of a divinized psychology, we end up with a watered-down Christianity. Part of my goal here today is separate the two, help to understand what is acceptable and what is unacceptable in humanistic psychology and the human potential moment, which is the practical manifestations of its main assumptions. Let me give some examples how humanistic psychology has affected Christianity. Benziger, which is a Catholic publishing house, published a series of religious texts for children. And he defines in those texts the main mission of Jesus was help us to become our true selves. It claims that Paul was very successful was because he had a good self-image. In a recent book on evangelical Protestant claims that sin is the result of a bad self-image. Much of humanistic psychology sees sin as simply making mistakes, which are opportunities for growth. The truth is that the assertion that this is true in a certain extent, but it doesn't go far enough. It only looks at sin from a natural, humanistic point of view, rather than a supernatural one. And that's the main issue with humanistic psychology. It's basically secular humanism. On the one hand, it's beyond its scope to deal with supernatural realities. Yet it attempts to do so, but in a humanistic way. It attempts to be a psychology, but also a religion. There are no boundaries between the natural and the supernatural, between psychology and religion. And the central tenets of psychology are, we should accept ourselves as we are. And the most important aspect of growth is self-awareness. We just have to learn to be ourselves, be our true self. But how do we know who is our true self? How do we develop our true self? For the humanists, our true self is that which is a result of being free from all external restrictions. If we follow our natural instincts and listen to our inner feelings, then we will be authentic. Our true self is an authentic self, a self-free hypocrisy, whereby we always try to do what we know is right for me. If you remember back in the 60s and 70s, that was a great mantra, don't be a hypocrite. My inner self and outer self are congruous. When we do what we don't want, then we are hypocrites. What is wrong with this approach? Now, if you remember, for example, back in the 60s and 70s, and even today, a lot of people say, well, if you're angry, then be angry. But don't try to smile. That's being phony. Well, guess what? Mother Teresa always told her sisters, when you're going out today to serve the people, and if you don't have joy and you can't smile, then don't go out. Those people have enough misery in their hearts. Now, a lot of these sisters don't feel that way, but they do it anyway out of love. But Carl Rogers say they're all hypocrites. Because when you don't feel that way and you're still trying to pretend you're happy or joyful, then you're a hypocrite. See, what's wrong with this approach, at first it denies original sin. It claims that all of our natural tendencies are good. Remember the book, I'm Okay and You're Okay? Because of original sin, we have a tendency towards sin, and our mind has become darkened, and our will has become weakened. That instead of giving in to our natural tendencies, we need to learn to master them according to the Spirit. Now, master doesn't mean control as much as direct them according to objective truth and good. One can argue, but doesn't Christianity teach we should love ourselves? How is that different from accepting ourselves? The difference is, we believe we should accept ourselves and love ourselves, but we don't always accept our behavior. Humanistic psychology argues to accept ourselves, accept every aspect of ourselves, even our behavior. We're asked to be non-judgmental of others and ourselves. What's important is expressing honestly what one feels. There's no right or wrong except to be dishonest about our feelings and experience. When we honestly let go and let it all hang out and simply experience life as it is without judgments, then you end up being happy, loving, and self-expressing. And of course, that's what we tried for a whole generation. The main purpose of life is acknowledge you are the source, then choose to be who you know you are. Everything flows from there. Life has only the meaning you give to it. Life has no extrinsic meaning or value apart what you give it. In the area of sexuality and marriage, fidelity is redefined as commitment to your own growth, equal commitment to your partner's growth, and sharing of the self-discovery accomplished through such growth. Thus, what's most important is fidelity to integrity, being who you really are, and respecting yourself and others, and not to a sexual and psychological bondage to each other. When partners are secure in their identity and trust the other, then there are new possibilities for new relationships, which may include sex. This takes maturity. The assumption is that one marriage contract doesn't fit everyone. Each couple has the freedom to decide what fits their taste. Now, you may look at all this and say, well, that just simply is nonsense. But I suggest to you this is a common belief today in most of our young people. Add the values of self-theory with a strident feminism, one can understand why divorce rates are so high today. Women insist they have the same right to lead the same self-focused life that men have been living for years. In other words, they got the right to be narcissistic too. Notions as duty and sacrifice are rejected, in favor of assertive autonomy. And autonomy, according to feminists, is restricted by the sacrifice of parenthood and duties of genuine love. Thus, contraception and abortion are necessary correctives so women can control their bodies and their lives. Those who advocate self-theory as the basis of modern humanistic psychology argue that there are no acceptable inhibitions or restraints, no absolutes in morals, no permanent aspect to our personality. There's a tendency to give a green light to any self-defined goal. Life basically is limitless, and change is normal and good. I don't know if you've been hearing a lot of these stump speeches these last few weeks of the politicians, and they're saying this. We have unlimited possibilities in this country, and we're talking, and really they espouse a very secular humanistic approach. You never ever hear about God. Never hear about the real problems of our society due to sin and the whole moral disorder we have in our country. It's never talked about. Human nature has only potentiality for good. When pressed, self-theorists would argue that their ideas are based on objective empirical data, primarily the emotions, the statements, and behavior of others, which obviously are not very objective. The consequence is that Donald Campbell, who is the former president of the American Psychological Society, describes American contemporary society as non-optimal production of under-inhibited, over-narcissistic, and over-selfish individuals, for which psychology must take considerable blame. He also asserts there's psychological validity to the concepts of sin, temptation, and original sin due to man's human, carnal, animal nature. See, self-theorists developed a new trinity: me, mine, and myself. So there is a very fundamental disagreement and fundamental conflict between Christianity and humanistic assumptions. Humanistic psychology asserts there are no accidents. Events occur because we choose them to occur. Every death, for example, is a suicide then. Every rape victim chooses to be raped. Social minorities are oppressed only if they allow themselves to be put in a position they call oppression. These statements derive from the law of karma taught in Eastern philosophy. But since not everything can be explained from this present life, for example, the birth of a crippled child, then reincarnation has been introduced. Thus, one's past life is a cause of present suffering. We suffer in the next life for the mistakes we make in this life. Thus, those who burnt witches at the stake in Salem, Massachusetts, witch trials, they become born blind in the next life as a consequence of blinding the witches themselves in the former life. We're totally responsible for our sufferings, and you get what you deserve. Since we choose everything that happens in our life, we choose what happens to us. There's some truth in that, but you can see the consequence. One time at a psychological convention, there was this young professor went to this older guy who was saying those kind of things like, nobody can make you angry. You choose to be angry. So he went up there and stomped on his foot and very deliberately stepped on his feet. And the guy kind of got upset. He says, you chose to be upset. I didn't do anything to you. That's what he's been preaching. So I guess it's not true anymore when it happens to you. Now, many Catholics also teach there's no accidents in life. But what's the difference? We do not believe we are the source of all that happens, but God is. God permits all that happens. God has a plan for holiness for each of us. Thus, everything that happens is God's permissive will, and that's kind of what we mean. Everything that happens in our lives is an opportunity for spiritual growth and holiness. God allows what's best for us at a particular moment. Our role is surrender to God, accept His permissive will. Humanistic psychology, on the other hand, counsels take responsibility for yourself and your life and develop powers of control over your life. See, we get control by surrender. They control by power and self-control. That's fundamentally different. See what I mean by using the same words but having totally different meanings, and that's one of our great dilemmas. God doesn't make mistakes, but we do. Suffering is a result of our collective sin. To that extent, we are responsible for suffering, yes. However, it's not to be interpreted on the individual level. Remember the gospel passage of the man born blind? Jesus was asked, who sinned, him or his parents? And Jesus said, neither, but so that the glory of God can be revealed. Then he healed the man. Some effects of sin can be directly related to our present suffering. For example, those who don't take care of their health by smoking, improper diet, lack of exercise, will probably suffer in the long run. There are those who take care of their health and do as much as possible, and they still get sick. We're asked to own our own sufferings and take responsibility for them, but it doesn't mean we cause them. We're asked to embrace God's will in the present moment and offer up our suffering in union with the sufferings of Christ on the cross. This is a contradiction in humanistic thought. On the one hand, we create our own reality. Thus, we are responsible for our sufferings and fate in this life. But on the other hand, the reason we chose badly is because of our upbringing. Our parents didn't love us enough. One of the underlying reasons humanist psychology turned Eastern religions, that many were getting bored and feeling burdened with being spontaneous and vibrantly human all the time, and burn out trying to self-actualize themselves. Humanistic psychology from the beginning was imbued with evangelical fervor. Many of the original proponents of humanistic psychology were sons of ministers or those who studied for the ministry but left to study psychology. Let's look at how we make ethical decisions in the two realms based on traditional psychology as well as Christianity. Traditionally, ethical behavior depended on what kind of person you were. Thus, much emphasis was placed on building character and habits of virtue. Today, however, we have a psychological model of moral education. It focused on problem solving. Moral problems are like problems in business or social policy. To solve problems, we need to be well informed, employ rational strategy, weigh the alternatives, etc., etc. Thus, people who are unethical are not lacking in character, but lacking decision-making skills. How often have you heard, for example, every time a person commits a horrible crime, and people say, well, he's not an evil person. There's no such thing, Rather, he had bad circumstance or upbringing and all that. The truth is, there is such a thing as evil. And some people basically are dominated by Satan, as I think Hitler was. Hitler was possessed by Satan. So was Stalin and others. So it doesn't necessarily mean they were immature, doesn't mean necessarily they were psychologically, they had all those problems, but it also can mean there's such thing as real evil. And that's not acceptable, of course, to psychology. Various classroom exercises are designed to help students acquire such skills. Character is a matter of the will. One builds character based on the choices one makes. Education today is focused on the mind. Thus, character and the heart are not involved. This is why most programs aiming at sex education or drug education don't deter behavior. Do you know what the success rate of most drug education programs in this country are? 5 to 8%. You know what the success rate of Chanakalo and Medjugorje is? 95 to 98%. What's the difference? Well, in this country, we're not allowed to use spirituality and prayer and other means as part of drug rehab, if it's secular. In Medjugorje, it's based upon prayer. It's based upon total group responsibility for all the work. They do all the work together. They go to adoration every day. They pray the rosary every day together. They also share in group meetings together their issues. And they look after each other and support each other. It's a real family approach with no specialists there, no psychologists, no doctors, no drugs. It's incredible. So it shows you the big difference. So when you don't bring in the spiritual, you don't bring in character, then it doesn't work. We must educate both the will and the heart, but you can't do this in a secular society. But this involves values and attitudinal change, which schools today believe is contrary to our Constitution and one's freedom of choice. And of course, one of the common arguments we hear all the time today is, they're going to do it anyway. Thus, let's give our students condoms and needles for drug addicts. This is a similar argument that punishment doesn't deter from crime. They're going to do it anyway. If this is true, it is true not all will be restrained by the threat of punishment, but many will be. If we make it difficult for teenagers to get birth control information and assistance, it doesn't follow they will do it anyway. Of course, nothing will make a difference unless there are prior inner restraints. The reason people do it anyway have less to do with irresistible human instincts and more to do with the fact that society has adopted the attitude they're going to do it anyway. If you have that attitude towards your children, they probably will. But if you have an attitude that they don't have to, and they can learn to control themselves and become a better person, they probably will. And if it's true, they're going to do it anyway, why did not they do it so much in the 30s and the 40s and the 50s? People's character didn't change that much. Then the incidence of crime, teenage pregnancy, was considerably lower than today. A large part of the reason is that people had different expectations about what people would and should do. And those expectations were widely known and accepted and reinforced at all social levels. As Joseph Soberin points out, abortion happened anyway before it was legalized, but it's much more common today. Part of the myth, they're going to do it anyway, is like the myth, you cannot legislate morality. As a matter of fact, we do legislate morality. Civil rights legislation over the long term did change attitudes and behavior and did bring about a change of heart. Law can have an educated as well as judicial function. If laws can help to change attitudes and hearts in the area of race relations, could it not do the same in the area of sexuality? But to what extent do we want law in our bedroom? That's another big issue that's thrown at us. So let's look at moral education. Most parents have little understanding how humanistic psychology has influenced our Catholic schools even in our CCD programs. In discussing moral issues, Lawrence Kohlberg, who developed the model of moral development, becomes a great paradigm to talk about moral issues. His main paradigm asserts that we all move from outer-directed thinking to inner-directed thinking. In other words, in the beginning I do think because someone says so, but eventually I do think because my inner values, my inner controls, because I want to do it. That's what we move from. And there's some good in that. In other words, the more mature people become, the more he will think for himself, follow his own conscience, instead of following external rules or commandments. Now, that's what happened after Vatican II, didn't it? Many people say, well, I'm going to follow my own conscience. There's many problems here. Number one, Vatican II said we must follow an informed conscience. That is, you must know what the church teaches, know what the scriptures say, know what the Pope says, etc., etc. And you must conform your heart and mind to that teaching. That's forming one's conscience. We don't have conscience out of the blue. See, today what it means for the average person, I suggest, conscience means do what I feel like doing. I wake up this morning, I feel like doing this, that's my conscience telling me. That's not conscience at all. But that's one of our great dilemmas. See, conscience develops from an external source evaluation to an inner source. That's what humanists tell us. Thus, an immature conscience one acts because some external authority says so. A mature person acts because he says so. It's a question of being true to who one is. But look at the consequence of that thinking. That means if I have homosexual instincts, I must be true to who I am and live accordingly. If I believe I no longer am growing in this marriage, that my spouse is stifling growth and doesn't allow me to be my true self, then I must have a sacred duty to get divorced. There's some truth in Kohlberg's model. It's important to internalize external rules, laws, and commandments, as long as I do so from inner sense of rightness and principle. The problem is we can only move to inner authority if our conscience is formed according to the teachings of Christ and His church. Sometimes we cannot give a totally rational reason for particular teaching, at least not one that's convincing. Thus, if we can't understand a particular rule or teaching of the church, does that mean I should ignore it until I can't understand it? Then that's making secular humanism the basis of my religion and not Christ's teachings. See, our religion is a revealed religion. It's not based on human reason. Reason is important. Helps to understand a lot. Helps to deepen our conscience and our faith. But there are many things we don't understand, certainly at certain times in our life. What about rules or teachings I can't figure out for myself? What do I follow? The church's teaching or my conscience? And what does it mean to follow one's conscience? And again, the basic assumption Kohlberg and humanistic psychology is that man is basically good. He has no inclination to evil. Selfishness, aggression, other undesirable behaviors are due to environment, but not due to us personally. The biblical notion that man is weakened by original sin, that our mind is clouded, is rejected. And since man is basically good, there's no need of repentance or forgiveness or God's grace. There's no need of Christ and His redemption. The truth is within each of us. Man is basically perfectible, can achieve this perfectibility through his own powers. This is what we call Pelagianism. It was a heresy in the early church. In the language of humanistic psychology, man is self-fulfilled, self-actualized, or self-determined. The sacraments are simply celebrations of human virtue. Confession doesn't really take away sin, but simply celebrates our sorrow for sin and God's removal of sin when we first felt sorry. And by the way, that's taught by several moral theologians today, even though it's heresy. Prayer becomes an act of dubious value. The practice of self-denial and sacrifice are obstacles to growth. In humanistic psychology, we grow by satisfying our wants, not by denying them. In other words, we should take care of all of our basic needs, like Abraham Maslow says. Other Christian virtues, as obedience and conformity to God's will, are very difficult to reconcile with self-will and autonomy. So again, you can see almost just a total opposite. There's a denial of objective truth. In humanistic psychology, the idea of absolute truth is infringement of freedom. The only truths are personal and subjective, and we hear all the time today, well, that may be true for you, but it's not true for me. Truth has become totally relative. This explains why humanist psychology is non-judgmental, while humanistic education is geared to having students create their own values. Now, if you remember, we used to have values clarification courses in high school. Well, how do you clarify values when you don't have any to begin with? So we stopped teaching values. It just drives me nuts in colleges today, because I taught at university many years. When the teacher's approach is, what do you think about it, Jimmy? Or how do you feel, Mary? Well, I could care less what you feel about it. I want to know what the truth is. What's the objective truth? And the assumption is you don't know that because that's why you're in my class. I'm here to teach you that. So I can't assume you already know. If you already know the subject, then get out of here. Take the next course. But see, we ask people what their opinions are. Who cares? They just take up time. Well, who cares how you feel? I don't care how you feel about 2 + 2 = 4. Nor do I care about what you think about God being divine, Christ being divine. It's the same truth. There is such thing as objective truth. But we have so objectified it that students now think, well, my opinion is just as good as the experts, as the theologians, or the Pope. And that's the way we teach today, as if your opinion counts as much as the Pope. If you teach that way. Can you understand that? It's difficult to square with Catholic belief that truth is both objective and unchanging, that ultimate truth as redemption, resurrection of Christ comes through divine revelation, then through self-revelation. The good news today is reduced to being nice. Again, in Ben's Year series for the Catholic youth, we are taught we have value by the very fact we are human. Well, there's truth in that. What is not clear, are we to become the person God intends us to be, or the person we want to be? How do we become our true self? And again, humanist psychology undermines especially sexual morality. The Benziger test emphasizes that marriage is a sacrament and sex is reserved for marriage. Okay. But then it discusses what young men and women should know about lovemaking. This section discusses different stages of sexual arousal. There's only 2 lines in the whole book dedicated to Christ's teaching on marriage. The context of these books reveal very little about man's sinfulness, a lot about man's goodness. It focused very little on grace, and a lot on man's deserved rewards, and very little about heaven or hell. When's the last time you've heard sermons on heaven, hell, purgatory, sin, that kind of stuff? Yeah. Well, that suggests a lot, doesn't it? Sin is viewed in human psychology as an impediment to growth and growth in Christ. Confession is a challenge to aid self-understanding. Wrongdoing is a result of poor decision-making. The resolution offered in Kohlberg's 7-step model of decision-making as a means of value clarification. And here's the basic question you're supposed to ask yourself. Does my decision make me feel good? Morality is taught using psychological premises rather than religious ones. Another method of firming up the self is positive thinking. One of the main questions is, how can I clarify my values if I don't have values to begin with? And again, how many of us have been subject to this feel-good theology? For 30, 40 years after Vatican II, we have taught our students a lot of nonsense, and we preach from the pulpit a very weak, watered-down Christianity that says all you have to do is feel good and love yourself and love others, and that's everything. The only problem is people have no clue what love means. Love means feelings, which it doesn't. Another religious education book used in Catholic schools in the past tells a story of an Olympic skier, Jill, who was paralyzed in an accident and how she came to believe in herself. She recovered because she believed she had a lot to live for and a lot to give to others. The impression is left that difficulties are overcome by tapping into deep inner resources. What about God's grace? Another Catholic textbook argues the greatest discovery in our generation is that human beings, by changing the inner attitude of their minds, can change the outer aspect of their life. What we saw in Theophostic prayer, that's true. But the difference is, how do we change our inner attitudes except through the Lord and the Holy Spirit? See, they believe the right attitude comes from deciding to esteem and believe in ourselves. The implication is that salvation is something we achieve for ourselves. One teacher was asked to explain the doctrinal content of the course, answered, "We're teaching the children to grow, to become whole people, whole persons. We teach the children to question, to choose values that make sense to them." Well, what about that? And what makes sense and what feels good to me right now, it's all relative. See, how do we become our true self? We become our true self by giving ourselves away. Become our true self in Christ. Not by going inward and becoming very introspective and trying to express my true feelings and be who I really feel and am. That's nonsense. We become our true self in total self-donation of love to one another. That's what the Scriptures teach us. Even in texts which do not present doctrinal truths, they tend to present them with a humanistic emphasis on truth as a personal construct, independent of objective norms. In other words, I create the truth. Even when teachers tend to emphasize we can't just make up our own truths, they fail to realize this is the direction humanistic psychology has led. Thus, in teaching many of the tenets of humanistic psychology along with Catholic truth, they in effect teach the truth as both subjective and objective. They communicate a double allegiance to both Catholicism and humanistic psychology. And that's what a lot of Catholic schools have done. They try to somehow combine the two, which leaves you totally confused. John Paul II wrote that technique is of value in catechesis to the extent it serves the faith that has been transmitted and learned. In this light, it's difficult to see how techniques of humanistic psychology are of value. At best, students will be confused by double messages. More likely, they'll come to believe that God's laws are arbitrary, and Catholic morality is subjective and relative. The unintended message is that church teachings are wide open to subjective interpretation, and that which the authority of the church pronounces on is no different from any other authority, no better than personal authority. And by the way, this is what I was taught in the seminary, that basically when the Pope speaks non-infallibly, he's given his own personal opinion. And since he's potentially fallible, then anybody could question him. And if I could find a group of theologians who are reputable, or a school of theology, or an individual theologian who's especially well known, who disagrees with the Pope, then in conscience I can teach contrary to the Pope. And this is what we all did on birth control. 80% of bishops and priests in the late 60s disagreed on birth control teachings of Paul VI. And we taught people to follow your own conscience, the Pope is wrong, and we felt totally in good faith in doing that, because that's how we were taught. Again, very much the humanism already taken over. Much effort is made in teaching and preaching to show Christianity is relevant to the modern world. Thus, along with saints, teachers often point to TV personalities as embodying virtue. Thus, the impression is given that secular culture is on even footing with Christianity. The Catholic Church appears no different from any secular movement that is sensitive and aware of the needs of society. When one puts the gospel between trendy and secular examples, then the Gospels are trivialized, and Christianity is a little bit more than ethical or value system. One learns that some people have well thought out ethical values, and knowing them can help you develop a similar value for yourself. One does not decide to teach divinely revealed truths by asking students to share their own opinions and feelings. The mystery of faith can only be grasped in an atmosphere of humility and reverence. The atmosphere of self-inquiry and self-concern doesn't work. Doesn't mean we shouldn't question. We do. That's how we learn. But not question just for the sake of questioning. Not question because it's arbitrary. That's what a lot of people are today. There is no answer. Therefore, my opinion is as good as anyone else. And the other thing here, too, we should realize that, just give you another example. One of the problems we have today in many of our Catholic schools, especially universities, that the assumption is we should have all values and all points of view expressed. Therefore, we have discussion abortion. Let's bring in Planned Parenthood as well, which a Jesuit University recently did. And let's bring in also other points of view. Well, what's that do to the students? It gives, even though we might teach in the end the Catholic point of view, it's given the impression already all the points of view are equal. And it's up to you to choose now which one makes most sense to you. And that's how most people teach, because we don't want to impose on people. We don't want to control them. Well, did Jesus impose when he taught the truth? No, we don't want to impose in a sense through fear, but we do want to teach clearly what's absolute truth. Now, it may feel like imposition, that's their problem. But we need to teach directly and always speak the truth in love. Now, why does the secular need the sacred? Today, we assume the secular can get along very well without the sacred. As you well know, in our culture today, the whole attempt is to get rid of anything religious, anything sacred in the public discourse. Let's get rid of God and God talk in our public sphere. Make it totally private, which means, it can be like your choice of soap. That's between you and yourself, what kind of soap you'll use today. And so is your religion. And that's the way we're treating Christianity today. It has nothing to do with our public life. We see this obviously in court decisions, which try to set up a wall of separation of church and state. You know where that came from? In 1957, Justice Black, by the way, who was a 33rd degree Mason, appointed by FDR. Black says, no longer do we have to appeal to the Constitution. Rather, we appeal to the spirit of the Constitution, which obviously opens the door that any judge now can determine their own agenda. Because what is the spirit of the Constitution? He says, one of the spirit is we need a wall of separation between church and state that's so impenetrable and so high that nothing ever impenetrate it. That's purely his own opinion. He quotes Jefferson. Jefferson didn't mean anything like that. In fact, Jefferson said just the opposite. And so even Franklin, who's considered a deist, talks about if we get rid of the Ten Commandments, then we lose the whole basis of our system of law in this country. So there's an excellent book called Primary Intent, which is the most excellent book out today, which goes through every detail of every court decision in history on the First Amendment. And it's done very, very well. But anyway, we did the same thing with Vatican II. No longer people go back to the documents of Vatican II. They even read them. They said, it's the spirit of Vatican II. And what's the spirit of Vatican II? Well, do what you want. Follow your own conscience. In other words, we finally have accomplished what the Protestant Reformation tried for years to accomplish. We now have the primacy of personal conscience over law, over commandments, over the church. And that's exactly what the Protestants wanted. We also have the primacy of personal interpretation of Scripture. That is, what it means to me is what it means. So we've done both now in the Catholic Church. Not officially, of course. We never approved that on the top level. But in fact, that's where the average person, I think, is today in the church. Because of the court decisions, we've led to indifference to religion and privatization of religion. Religious beliefs are seen as nice and comfortable and even helpful, but not necessary to live a good life or pursue a good society. Many Americans now believe that secular culture can maintain morality without a sacred core. Thus, if a symbol like the Christmas crib offends, it's better to replace it with non-offensive symbols like a Santa Claus. After all, the crib is only a nice tradition and not worth the fuss. What does the sacred do for the state? Simply, the sacred makes sense out of life, a role that state cannot do for itself, and yet without such meaning it cannot exist. And by the way, what's the whole basis of society? Is the family. Once we undermine the family, we have undermined all society. Society will necessarily crumble and disintegrate, and that's exactly what we're headed for right now in this country. As C.S.C. puts it, if there is no God, then everything is perishable. The secular attitude is that morality as a societal construct requires no reference to a sacred or religious dimension. As people came to be blessed in God, what happens? You rely more on law then. Man needs a fixed system of order. Sooner or later, purely legal attempts to provide and maintain order will fail, since law itself is eventually revealed to be arbitrary when it's cut off from the supernatural. This will take many forms. Thus, in our society, the relationship between adults and child, particularly in the school and home, has become a contractual one rather than a sacred one. and this change has disastrous consequences. For example, where do teachers get their authority over students? Remember, and where do parents get their authority over children? Well, in Christianity, the authority of the Father participates in the authority of God the Father. For the marriage bond is a sacred covenant between Christ and His church, and the family is a sacred unit. Parents have authority over their children as a mystical duty, as a God-given responsibility, and not from the rational contract that's mutually agreed upon. Schools and teachers, by extension, share in this authority because they stand in loco parentis, which means in the place of the parents. That's where they get the authority, from the parents. The respect for teachers derives from respect for one's parents. But what's today's prevailing notion of authority in our public schools? The social contract. Authority comes from consent of the governed. It is legitimate insofar as it conforms to reasonable rules freely agreed upon. And once consent is given, then both parties are bound by a contract as in a business deal. So, for example, what do we have today? We have sixth graders in Maine receiving contraceptives without the parents' knowledge or consent. Just voted this year in law in Maine. We have in Massachusetts a second grade textbook called He and He, where the prince falls in love with the king, required reading. We have in California, as of January the 1st, it's now in effect required in California. It doesn't say explicitly, but that's what the intent is, that we now must push that the homosexual relationship is equal to a heterosexual marriage. And that's going to be shown up more and more now in our schools, in our public discourse. And you become a hate crime, you disagree with that. We now have the problem in many parts of this country, I cannot preach any law without being a hate crime on any biblical text on homosexuality, and on and on and on. This is getting much worse. Not too long ago in the state of Missouri, a 9-year-old girl brought her lunch to school in a public school, and she was a Catholic girl, so she made the sign of the cross and ate her lunch. The principal came over and warned her she was never to do that again, otherwise she'd be expelled from the school. This is the way we are coming in this society to totally make it secular. But the biggest crime is what? That we are so passive. We are doing nothing to allow it. We're allowing it to happen. And this has been going deeper and deeper. And soon we're going to wake up and realize there is no religion, in public. So this is a challenge to every one of us to realize we can't just sit back. Every parent here should know what their children are being taught in the schools. They should know what textbooks, even in the Catholic schools. Archbishop Hughes of New Orleans did a study of all the Catholic textbooks in high school and grade school in this country. He found out 60% were in error. This is our Catholic textbooks. What about the public ones? Now, this is the problem because today, sometimes people lose their faith as much in the Catholic school as they do in the public school, the way things have been taught, especially in our universities today. So we got to be much more responsible. But here's the problem. If you parents decide now to take responsibility and realize you're the primary educators of your children, as John Paul told us, and as Christ himself teaches, you will get in trouble. There was a parent in Massachusetts didn't want his daughter in a kindergarten being exposed to homosexuality, and the parent then was put in jail for violence. There's the problem. Today, parents don't have rights. We have lost them because parents sat back passively, let them be taken away from them. So this is something we all have to look at. And it's going to take great suffering and even imprisonment to regain those rights. But parents are the primary education of the student. And of course our society says, no, we schools know better than you do how to teach your children. And we know better what's right for you and what they should learn and not learn. This is the dilemma we're in today in this society. So we believe today parents and teachers hold their authority not from God, but from consent of the state. Therefore, the state has a duty to make the church and family do business the way it does business. Now, look in California again. The requirement today that all Catholic social agencies must dispense the morning after pill. Again, they know better than us. It's irrelevant now, it's contrary to our faith, and longer holds. This is best for the people, they say. One consequence of all this is going to produce hostility between generations. I don't know if you know this, but some states actually have a Bill of Rights for students now. And a Bill of Rights, which means that students have their rights against their parents. What does that say? but our society and our family. After all, if we are all equal and fellow citizens, what right do you have to tell me what to do? A child can say that now to his parents. This will be the reason of the child and the student. Once we divorce traditional authority from the sacred, it appears as an arbitrary imposition of the will. Children perceiving the most lenient and kindness of families and schools are oppressive. This attitude is reinforced by television, which often eliminates distinction between child and adult. How many times you watch TV where the children are smarter than their parents? And of course, men are just totally stupid, if you look at a lot of the ads today. Children on TV often talk and act like adults, seem wiser beyond their years. They must intervene in adult affairs to set things right. Parental authority is not scorned as long as perceived as reasonable, can be explained to the satisfaction of the child as in his own best interest. But children expect to be treated as adults. Consequently, adults will experience increased resentment towards their children. If children are simply fellow citizens and not a sacred trust, then why should parents sacrifice for them? Children become seen as burdens and hindrances to self-development. There's a great emphasis today on the legal rights of children. The only thing a parent today is protected against is their love. These reflections explain why parents who want to be notifying their children to see contraception in schools such a sensitive issue. The school's attitude is none of the parent's business. This is also true, as you know now in most states, a child can have an abortion without the parent's knowledge or consent as well. So, schools have lost traditional authority. For example, a student was wearing a marijuana stencil t-shirt was ignored when the lawyer told the principal not to interfere. In Boston, students are given booklets informing them of their rights and legal resources. Teachers and principals no longer have authority they once had. In losing the power to discipline, they also lose the power to care. The attitude becomes one of civil servant or bureaucrat towards clients one must serve. There's a loss of love and loyalty for the students as well as for the teachers. But when this happens, then obedience must be secured only by fear and force. Consequently, we have more battered children, more social workers serve as watchdogs over parents, and more security guards to police the schools. Many parochial schools have retained the notion of local parentis and local deus that have less disciplinary problems than public schools. So let's talk about psychology and healing then. Jesus said to the woman with the hemorrhage who had been suffering for 12 years, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your disease." The word well in the Greek also means whole, refers to salvation, rescue from sin, and restoration to eternal life. Thus, healing involves more than physical cure, but also spiritual healing. In humanistic psychology, is also concerned for healing and wholeness. Christian Jungian psychologists coined the saying, "Holiness is wholeness." However, wholeness means something quite different in psychology than it meant for Christ. In psychology, wholeness means integration, mind, body, and spirit. This is also true for Christians. However, the difference is, for the psychologist, integration means harmony between one's basic instincts and feelings with one's behavior. For the Christian, it means one's mind and spirit in conformity to Christ, and thus one's behavior reflects that conformity. For the Christian, wholeness is centered in Christ. For a psychologist, it's centered in oneself. For the Christian, happiness and self-fulfillment cannot be pursued directly. They are byproducts of other pursuits. We're most happy when we're doing something else, not thinking about happiness. Happiness occurs when we're forced outside of ourselves. The self-awareness is not a prescription for happiness. The same is true of self-actualization. To concentrate on oneself, whatever the goal means, withdrawal of interest in other people. The tendency is to view others as simply tools to serve one's own self-interests, whether it be for personal happiness or self-fulfillment. When we focus primarily on ourselves, we become restless and begin to feel life as a burden. We get tired of all that self-efforting. We find ways to get rid of the burden through alcohol, drugs, sex, TV, or some other anesthesia. Concentration on the self is self-defeating and leads not to self-actualization, but self-focused seriousness, self-preoccupation, to withdraw interest in the world and in God. Bishop Sheen has said, the modern age tendency is towards affirmation of the ego. The exaltation of selfishness leads us to ride roughshod over others to satisfy our self-centeredness. It certainly has not produced much happiness, for the more the ego asserts itself, the more miserable it becomes. Psychology talks a lot about being one's real self. Christianity also talks about distinction between the false and true self. But in psychology, it means being faithful to your will, your feelings, and your instincts. For Christians, it's just the opposite. It means conform to Christ. Jesus is the ideal self. The more we are conformed to Christ and enter into his life, the more we become our true self, the self God created us to be. Thus, instead of asserting my ego, I surrender my ego as a Christian and put my trust in Christ. So we become our true self when we get out of ourself. Extreme forms of mental, emotional illness as paranoia, schizophrenia, depression, anxiety disorders are extreme forms of self-absorption. Self-surrender is the main answer rather than more self-knowledge. We need to break out of our self-prison. Psychologists would argue depressed people lack a good self-image. That's the main reason for the depression. Let's suppose that is true. But where does self-esteem come from? Is it from the inside? But what's on the inside? People who are deeply depressed often feel hopeless and despairing on the inside. Thus, to tell someone who is depressed they have low self-esteem is like telling someone who has eye problems they need better vision. Psychologists often blame lack of self-esteem on parents' lack of unconditional love for their children. This certainly has some effect, but is that really the answer? Implicit is that people with good self-image don't suffer from depression. This is true when things go well, but it's like saying a thief is a good man when he's not stealing. Very few people stand up well in the face of job loss, divorce, or serious illness. The more self-esteem is emphasized in our culture, the more suicide and depression increases. The truth is, when we fail and hit bottom, psychology has little to offer us without a spiritual foundation. See, in California, under Jerry Brown, we had the law. We had to teach self-esteem in our high schools. And we spent millions and millions doing that. They did last year, finally, a big study, how this consequence of all this study and teaching. And guess what we found? It doesn't change behavior. All self-esteem does, that people who do wrong, they just now feel good about doing wrong. They feel better about themselves. It doesn't make them actually better people, though. That's the problem. What's the difference between emotionally healthy people and neurotics? Is that one is full of care and the other is carefree. People who are healthy are not continually worried about their health. They're not constantly paying attention to their inner process. If I believe it's all up to me, then I can't be carefree. I have to walk carefully. There's a difference between the humor of Woody Allen, which is very self-conscious, and a humor that leads us to roar with laughter. See, Christianity makes no sense without sin. If we're not sinners, then there's no reason for God to become man, and we don't need God. Today we live in a climate in which there's little sense of sin, little sense in what Christianity is all about. Psychology puts a lot of emphasis on accepting ourselves as we are. Thus, guilt and feeling bad about ourselves is considered unhealthy. For the Christian, there is healthy guilt. And when we sin, we should feel bad about ourselves. As Paul writes, I do not do the good I want, and I do the evil I don't want to do. The psychological remedy is to change our beliefs when our behavior is out of harmony with ourselves. The Christian response is to pray for grace and forgiveness and repent and turn our life towards God. Psychologists will say we need to improve our self-concept. The problem is good self-concept doesn't change our sinful behavior, but makes us feel better by being a sinner. Then we don't feel bad by being a sinner. Let's suppose there's a man who's trying to suppress his tendency to anger, who makes sacrifice for the sake of others, who tries to keep his sexual instincts in line. He's trying to be a good Christian. But psychologist tells him he should trust his instincts and they are good. He shouldn't be afraid to be himself. There's no reason to be afraid of his anger and sexual instincts. Thus, he shouldn't be ashamed of doing the things that come naturally to him. He needs to learn to accept himself as he is. What is counsel is a natural, humanistic approach to life. What is forgotten is that animal and human instincts are different. Thus, the man above, through counseling, begins to see himself differently. If he thinks he's been denying himself his natural rights and needs, now he sees his struggle not as a temptation to master, but as an opportunity for personal growth. The question is not is it right or wrong, but is it growth-producing and honest behavior. Instead of becoming more self-aware, he will blunt his moral sensitivity and moral conscience. This is the basic approach that most therapists today use in counseling homosexuals, but also in other areas like masturbation, premarital sex, and extramarital sex. The fact that they become used to things as they become second nature says nothing of the rightness or wrongness. The more we sin, the more clouded we become in our ability to see sin. The more we get drunk, the less the problem it seems, unless we lose total control and pass out. And even then, it won't seem too wrong if we don't get hurt and enjoy the party. You know, how often I hear students tell me in college, oh, I had the most wonderful time last night. I got totally wasted. You know, totally drunk, totally passed out, and that's a wonderful time. Illicit sexual encounters won't seem so bad. It's just the afterthoughts that bother us. Then soon the afterthoughts don't bother us either. Cheating and double dealing in business ventures becomes seen as good business sense. When we develop habits of self-acceptance, it becomes difficult to be objective about our sinful habits. The issue is not one of weakness, which leads to occasional falls, but hardened hearts. This is so because sin has become comfortable and second nature. When you take the label sin away, you're also taking away forgiveness, repentance, and therefore freedom and responsibility. We come to understand God then as a good-natured and understanding therapist who doesn't really care if we sin. It doesn't really bother him, and he understands. We then see ourselves for God as clients and patients. This is the meaning for us, who are children of God, creating His own image and likeness. So let me just conclude here with talking about the consequences humanist psychology has had for the church, because I suggest that one of the major factors in the sexual scandal in the church of priests is humanistic psychology. See, what happened in the late 60s and 70s, priests were taught all this, and therefore they felt they needed to explore their sexuality, because therapists were telling them that, because a lot of them thought himself as very repressed, and therefore therapists was saying, well, if you don't know you're homosexual, find out, try it out, see what happens. Well, there was interesting experiments done by Dr. William Coulson. Coulson was the assistant to Carl Rogers, one of his major assistants. And what Coulson did, took two groups of people as guinea pigs, the Immaculate Heart Sisters in Los Angeles and the Franciscan priests and brothers in the Santa Barbara province. With both of them, what he did encounter groups with them, did sensitivity training with them, and taught them a lot of humanistic psychology. Within 2 years of the experiment, there were 450 sisters in LA in the beginning. They were left with 100 sisters 2 years later. They had 80 schools in the LA diocese. They were down to 2 after 2 years. What happened? Many of the sisters came to realize, they said, that they were suppressed, living in a male-dominated church. And because of that, they're allowed to be their true self. And one young sister said, I thought I was relatively happy as a sister and really enjoyed my work until I learned from Dr. Coulson how oppressed I was. And I realize now that underneath I'm really a pagan at heart. So I have to leave the sisters now to become my pagan self. There's another, in the Franciscans, what happened? Now, one of the usual rules in the seminary was that you couldn't visit another seminary's room after 10 o'clock at night unless permission those on the top staff. And right away, Dr. Coulson said, that's keeping them very immature. You don't trust them. So get rid of that rule, which they did. Within 6 months, half the seminarians were sleeping with half the faculty. This is the kind of things that started happening. Then all of a sudden, seminarians were complaining, and not other seminaries too, not just there, to the superiors, well, so-and-so is acting out. In fact, I know a case, for example, one seminarian was becoming a prostitute on weekends, a male prostitute. And he complained to the superiors, well, he's got to find himself. You've got to understand and be tolerant. That's the kind of thinking that's still going on in some seminaries right now. Not as bad as it was, but still a big problem. So the question is, what has happened? After being a laboratory experiment, most of the nuns left the church, feeling oppressed by the church, stifled in their effort to be a real person. The college and most of the schools have been closed. Within a short time, the nuns become humanized, feminized, and revolutionized. And the main reason the nuns gave that left the community, which most did, their inability to be me, to be my true